Hey guys, welcome back to the fanfic reread project. In this episode, we are going to continue our reread of The Dark Knight Rises with a Bruce chapter. Just so you know, if you hear any weird banging noises in the background, we're getting a new air conditioner put in downstairs. Also, it was thundering a little while ago. Maybe that's over, but if you hear that, now you know why. Oh god. Anyway, so let's get right into it. Bruce jolted awake. He hadn't had a sleep so blank since the day of his parents' funeral, and he hadn't woken so suddenly since the last time he'd had nightmares. The sky was bright yellow outside of his window, making the gold accents glow across the painted black walls. He thought he had woken up earlier than usual, but then he caught sight of the clock. It was 6:30 in the evening. Interesting. Well, I see you finally decided to join the world of the living, Alfred said as he entered the room, carrying a tray with breakfast. Well, why didn't you wake me up? Bruce said as he sat up. He was grateful for the food. He was ferociously hungry. I couldn't. It was the strangest thing. I've never seen you oversleep this long. Are you all right? I'm fine. In reality, he was more than fine. He felt better than he had in a while. He was extremely well rested. When he rose from the bed, he realized that the pain in his leg had dulled slightly. He was surprised the stuff Fox had given him was working so fast. He had said it might take a few days. He allowed himself to eat and then immediately went downstairs. So I guess this is what Bruce, not metaphorically, but just left with, quote unquote, when he went to Fox's office in the last chapter. That's interesting. How does Lucius Fox just have, is it just pain medicine? Can he do that? That's weird. I just keep thinking about, because in the movie, the thing that he gave him was that leg brace, which we're going to see in a few seconds. But here he gives him that and also throws in a little bit of the juice. How can he? That seems wildly inappropriate and illegal. You can't just be giving people medicine, even if you are a super smart genius from Wayne Enterprises. Anyway, moving on. Even with all the lights on, the cave still felt dark. He hadn't been down there in the night since the fire, but even then they'd done a better job lighting the place. He pushed it out of his mind as he sat himself on his old work table and pulled out the brace Fox had given him. He placed it on the left knee first and stood, letting it tone. You've got the wrong leg, sir, he heard Alfred say as he passed through the arches. You start with the good limb so it learns your optimum muscle patterns. He sat back down and switched to the right knee. Gingerly, he pressed the button on the side. It tightened, digging painfully into his leg. Alfred grimaced as Bruce let out a hiss. Is it terribly painful, sir? And you're welcome to try it, he said through gritted teeth. Happy watching. Thank you, sir. Bruce got to his feet. The pain in his leg had disappeared, and he didn't move awkwardly like he had before. Not bad. He aimed a roundhouse kick at the wall. A few of the bricks came loose and fell to the ground. Not bad at all. He turned to Alfred. Have you checked that name, Bane? I ran it through some databases. He's a mercenary, no other known name. I just realized that I'm doing this little accent, but then I pronounce everything like an American. So, Alfred, I'm pretty sure would say databases, not databases, but whatever. He's never been seen or photographed without a mask. He and his men were behind a coup in West Africa that secured mining operations for our friend John Daggett. He should have been surprised, but he wasn't. Now Daggett's brought them here. It would seem so. Bruce turned and headed for the basin. Sir, if you really are considering going back out there, you need to hear some of the rumors surrounding Bane. I'm all ears, he said, moving over the rocks. There is a prison, in a more ancient part of the world, a pit where men are thrown to suffer and die. But sometimes a man rises from that darkness. Sometimes the pit sends something back. Bane, yes. Born and raised in hell on earth. Born in a prison? And no one knows why or how he escaped, but they know who trained him once he did. Ra's al Ghul, your mentor. Bruce stopped. He plucked Bane from a dark corner of the earth and trained him in the blackest disciplines of combat, deception, and endurance, just like you. Bane was a member of the League of Shadows? Almost. Bruce cocked his head to the side. He was excommunicated before he could. A man considered too extreme for Ra's al Ghul is not to be trifled with. Bruce felt his chest tighten. I didn't realize I was known for trifling with criminals. That was then. You can strap up your leg and put the mask back on, but it won't make you what you were. Okay, so let's pause right here to talk about a consistent thing that's happened in, I think, maybe all three of these, but definitely in Batman Begins and just now. Bruce having physical reactions when people say, mildly negative things. about Batman. Not really negative, but when people low-key come at him about the whole Batman thing, but particularly when it's Alfred. But he did it with Ra's al Ghul in Batman Begins too. In some cases, I kind of get it, but he felt his chest tighten. Definitely sounds like he's having like angina or something, or like a heart attack. It does not sound like, oh man, I feel really bad because you said that Batman isn't needed and I feel like he is. Don't insult me. Like in Batman Begins, if I'm remembering correctly, it's Bruce's like stomach that has a reaction, which is still kind of like but it's a little bit more normal because it's your stomach. It doesn't come across like he's literally having like chest pains. It's kind of weird, but you know what? It reminds me a lot of the way that I wrote the Daenerys character. This is from Profs 1.0, so this will be like out there. But in Profs 1.0, when I did the Dany chapters that I ended up removing all at the same time, particularly in chapter 2, but across her chapters, Dany would get really nervous and constantly feel like pains and stuff, but it really made it seem like she was sick. Or no, she would be constantly like, she feels like shudders in her heart, and it's the same thing, and it's like, is she okay? Because that's not normal, you know? But that's a little detail, but it is a consistent detail throughout this thing that when people are kind of like, well, but especially when it's Alfred, is like, you know, when you do this Batman thing, maybe you shouldn't do this. And then Bruce is like, my stomach did a flip. How dare you? Like, but I guess at least it's consistent. Moving on. If he's everything you say he is, then this city needs me. Yes, this city needs Bruce Wayne, your resources and your knowledge, not your body, not your life. You're afraid that if I go back out there, I'll fail. No, I'm afraid that you want to. Bruce raised an eyebrow, but Alfred just turned and left. He did not understand how, in any world, Alfred could think he was returning just to get himself killed. Bruce didn't fear death anymore, but he certainly wasn't searching for it either. In reality, it wasn't about him at all. It was about his city and the people whose lives he might be saving from this monster of a man, if Alfred was to be believed. Failure was an unfortunate side effect. Every medicine had side effects. And that is the end of that. So, that chapter is actually pretty good. Part of the reason why it's good is something that I cannot talk about yet, but suffice to say, the thing that I cannot comment on is actually done pretty well here, so that's nice. So one of the comments that I wanted to make, if we want to get specific for a moment, is the fact that, like, the way Alfred describes the prison that Bane came from always kind of makes me a little bit uncomfortable because it kind of feels racist. And I know that might be weird. It's like, how can you racistly describe a prison? But, like, the fact that he calls it, like, yes, a more ancient part of the world, and he's not necessarily wrong, but the way that he says it is, like, that's a weird turn of phrase to use when compared to literally, like, everything else modern, well, not literally everything else, but most other places, modern America is a relatively young country. There are lots of more ancient parts of the world. I don't know. I just like that, and the use of the word black seems especially out of place because it's a Batman story, and Batman is a character who wears black, and in this version he actually is black. So it seems even less appropriate, even coming from Alfred. But like, England is a more ancient part of the world, and like the blackest disciplines, like the whole thing just kind of reeks of racism that the character doesn't realize is racist. Which in the source material, not excusable, but makes more sense because everyone's white except for like 2 people. But in this, it's kind of like, ooh, because you can't be a guy who works for black people for how fucking long? It's been like, what, 30 years? Something like that. I think Alfred was around before Bruce was even born, and Bruce is 35 in this. So yeah, and then he's talking like that, like, what? It's just weird. But anyway, outside of that, because that, again, this is a problem with the source material, not my actual story, but I shouldn't have put it in there. And for someone who is going through this and putting in all this work to make you know that Selina's not white, and making it so that 3 of the 4 POV characters weren't white people, and like doing that consciously, I should have caught that and been like, let me just change a few words, you know? But yeah, so that's a little bit weird. But the other thing I want to talk about is we have a change, a pretty significant change to the story here. I think this is the first change that impacts the plot, but also happened in the story, which is that Bane did not join the League of Shadows. You might be like, well, how does that impact the plot? But or at least as far as they know, he hasn't joined the League of Shadows. Wink. But yeah, so that's kind of a significant, like, the fact that it's not just brought up here, but because in the movie, when Alfred says all of these things, he's not actually talking around it, but the script has him talk around confirming or denying a lot of Bruce's assumptions about Bane. So I think a really good example of that is when Bruce asks if Bane was born in a prison, and Alfred doesn't answer the question and just says, no one knows how he escaped. And that, in the movie, that happens because when we talk about the person who was born in the prison, it's not Bane they're talking about, but Talia al Ghul. So that makes sense that he kind of talks around that. But here's what I will say, and I won't get any deeper into this until we get a lot further into the story. But that doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. But yeah. Anyway, I forgot. Wasn't I talking about Bane not being part of the League of Shadows anymore? But yeah, that is very... Oh yeah, because it's brought up very specifically to get things back on track. That little detail is brought up specifically when... As for most of the other details about Bane, Alfred just kind of throws some stuff out there, and then when Bruce asks questions, Alfred, just like in the movie, doesn't really answer any of them. But that one thing when Bruce is like, he was in the League of Shadows, Alfred feels the need to clarify, no. So that kind of raises the eyebrow a little bit. But yeah, like I said, good chapter. Let's move on to John. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, but not enough to make it darken yet. A sea of police cars had formed in front of the stock exchange building, dyeing the white marble pulsating red and blue. Officers and SWAT flooded the street. Throughout the story, SWAT officers are just referred to as like SWATs or SWAT, which I think is really weird, especially because aren't SWAT officers technically called ESU? Which, I don't know, because I haven't seen the term SWAT used all that frequently anymore, but I think ESU and SWAT are they're the same people, right? Am I wrong about that? I don't know anything about fucking cops. As you could see if you listened to Batman Begins and saw Gordon's chapters. John hopped out of her cruiser, noticing a construction truck blocking one of the roads. Hey, she said, running over, I need you to move your truck. We have a situation. But where can I move it? She started to point behind the truck, but the barriers were rising from the street. She sighed. Just stay in your vehicle, okay? He nodded. This seems wildly dangerous. Like, I understand that they have to get, like, the barriers in the street up as quickly as possible. I'm assuming all the barriers are controlled by the same, like, switch or something. But if they aren't, like, maybe call up the people and be like, yo, stop. We have a civilian here who's just kind of, like, stuck. That seems wildly. Like, they don't know who's going to come out of there. They could have, like, bombs and flamethrowers and shit and blow that truck the fuck up. Especially, like, did it say, like, what the truck was carrying? That could be very dangerous. Anyway, when she went back, the security chief was talking frantically to Foley and Lieutenant Roberts. You've got to get in there. This is a hostage situation, Foley started. This is a robbery. They've got direct access to the online trading desk. I'm not risking my men for your money. It's not our money, it's everyone's. Really? Robert said. Mine is in my mattress. If you don't shut these guys down, the stuffing in your mattress will be worth a lot less. Foley turned to Roberts. Cut the cable line and shut down the cell tower. That'll slow him down. SWATs poured out of trucks and took places all over the street and on top of buildings. They had snipers on the roofs of every building in minutes. She moved back for her cruiser and grabbed her gun. The whole situation had her on edge, especially with what happened with Gordon. The two things might not have been connected, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were. And on top of that, since when did people rob stock exchanges? Honestly, I gotta say, John's instincts are pretty spot on. I mean, that's kind of on purpose, but also, like, I like how she's the only person who is like, okay, but why are they robbing the stock exchange? It's like she's the only person who seems to have an awareness of, like, where they are and what's actually happening. But, moving on. The roar of engines made her jump halfway out of her skin and whip around. Motorcycles jumped down the steps of the stock exchange and sped toward one of the side streets. They tore right through the cloud of officers and right for the barriers, jumping them like goddamned ramps. How the hell did they get motorcycles in there? Lieutenant Roberts said, voicing the thoughts of everyone that remained. John just stood there in awe. She came back to herself when she noticed Foley rushing toward her. "Let's roll," he said, jumping into her car. "They've spotted the Batman." There couldn't be any way this could get any weirder. She felt unsure, but she got in, partially for his benefit and partially because she didn't have a choice. All right, so this is a good place to stop and talk about the for his benefit thing that happens throughout this, which I'm pretty sure I mentioned in Batman Begins, like briefly, but I don't know if I talked about it like by name, quote unquote, or in depth. So, the whole, like, she did X for his benefit thing is supposed to be sort of like a comment on sexism and the fact that men kind of, like, walk around and do all this stuff and just expect women to do things, and then these women go along with it, quote unquote, for his benefit, so they don't really, like, cause a scene or anything like that. In John's case, and in this instance, the comment really works because here she is. Not only is she a rookie, she is like a rookie who has gotten on Foley's bad side at least once during this when she's like, maybe we should, save the commissioner. And he's like, get her out of here, So at this point, Foley kind of just like running over to her car and being like, we're gonna go chase the Batman, when she literally is like the person who kind of called the Batman back into this situation. She's kind of like, oh shit. But she has to do it because that's her boss, And also, like, again, it's that feeling that, like, not just because she's his subordinate, but the fact that she is also a woman, that she is just supposed to be like, okay, and jump into the car with him. Like, that never crosses his mind, seemingly. So here, the comment really fucking works. Where it falls apart is in Selina's chapters, and part of this is because I just did not do a thorough enough job when I did the editing. With Selina, it doesn't really work because every time Selina makes the comment, she makes it in relation to Bruce, who, as I have explained multiple times at this point, is not a man. Like, when you have a non-binary character who presents in a feminine way and a cisgender woman, the commentary, like, oh, I did this for his benefit, doesn't work. Because the problem is, and I mentioned this again in Batman Begins, that when I originally wrote this series, Bruce was a cisgender dude. So that commentary worked, sort of, but there was a dramatic irony of us knowing that he is Batman and all this other stuff. So it's like, the dynamic is a little bit different, but it's still kind of like, is there. And you start to maybe like view Bruce's actions a little bit differently, But when you lobby it and like when you change it and the character is non-binary and you don't take that out, it just seems like Selina is like misgendering him internally or something like that. It just comes across very like, and this is a thing that actually does pop up in a later chapter, which we will talk about when we get to that chapter, but it's just not a good look. And I feel like I should have realized that when I was going through, especially because Batman Begins is the first story, I think. I actually tried to put like themes and messages about like social issues in it. Yes, Batman Begins has that like one-off comment about like, well, white guys, we got all the opportunities. But like, that was one thing that happened. And the story itself doesn't comment on it. But this story tried to. And then you also have that. And it feels like, in the midst of me doing all the editing, because all of the chapters, with the exception of a few later ones, I think, most of the chapters that have this in it have been edited. I should have thought about that and maybe realized like, oh, it doesn't really stand up, and taken it out. It's just sad because, again, when you do it with John and Foley, totally makes sense. But Selina and Bruce falls flat, Moving back to the story. They sped down the street the same way the other cruisers had gone, getting onto the highway. Foley leaned into his radio. "Call everyone in. Every car patrol, beat cop, off duty too." He looked out at the city rushing by, a smile plastered on his face. "I'm gonna do what Jim Gordon never could." "What's that?" John asked. "I'm gonna take down the Batman." She raised an eyebrow. "Sir, what about the armed robbers?" But he ignored her. Oh my God. Honestly, I do have to say that given what I remember about the unedited part of this story, Foley actually has a pretty impressive character arc. But seeing what he started out as is just like, oh, you just kind of want to like slap him, As they pass under a low overpass, she noticed that a few of the lights lining the ceiling had gone out. A motorcycle lay in the middle of one of the leftmost lanes, and the ground was littered with metal and glass. Foley's radio came to life. "One bike's pulled off, no hostage. Should we pursue?" Foley wasted no time in answering. "Negative. Stay on the Batman." "But, sir, he's getting away." "Oh, who do you want to catch?" he said, turning on her. Oh, that was John that said that. There should have been a dialogue tag there, because the dialogue that preceded the radio coming to life, quote unquote, also doesn't have a tag, but because of the context, it makes sense. But it makes it look like this is also said by the radio when it's not. So, but sir, he's getting away. Who do you want to catch? He said, turning on her. Some robber or the son of a bitch that killed Harvey Dent? She didn't answer. She was conflicted. After what she heard, she didn't know what to believe anymore. If the Batman had killed Harvey Dent, then why had Gordon covered it up? She had heard the two were tight, but not that tight. But if Batman hadn't killed Dent, then why did they lie about it? There was something going on there, but she couldn't think about it at the moment. Foley had her too busy. So that passage is a little confusing, and I have a hard time trying to figure out what I was actually saying there. Because basically what John says is, if Batman had killed Harvey Dent, then why had Gordon... I think that is supposed to say, if Batman hadn't killed Harvey Dent, then why had Gordon covered it up? But if Batman had killed Harvey Dent, then why did they lie about it? Okay, I think that makes slightly more sense. No, because they didn't lie about him killing Harvey Dent if he killed Harvey Dent. Yeah, that passage is a little bit weird. I'm not, sure what I was trying to say there, which is sad because these are questions that need to be asked. Yeah, I have no idea what happened there. He started shouting into his radio again. How the hell did you let him go? He has a lot of firepower, the voice said back. And you don't? We're not letting a nut with a bad attitude and a bunch of fancy gadgets run this town again. Do you hear me? He's heading downtown. Then he's as dumb as he dresses. Close it down, gentlemen. She could see the other police cars on the streets below them. She pulled off at the nearest exit ramp. It seemed he'd gone farther downtown than she would have thought, almost to the gray zone. Foley made her force her way up to the front of the flood of cruisers. They caught a glimpse of the Batman, cape trailing out behind him as he sped along on his motorcycle. The lights of another group of cars became visible down the road. He hit a hard right, the wheels of his bike flipping to turn him, and he disappeared down an alleyway. See, again, this is where the confusion with how Gotham is laid out becomes sort of clear, because it's like, oh, he went really far downtown to the gray zone. The gray zone's only in the middle of town. This is why I get confused with the fact that quote-unquote downtown Gotham is not actually on the southern part of the island, and I should have changed that, because I was trying to portray it so that all of the lower class neighborhoods, it kind of started high class and got lower class the further south you went, but that doesn't really make sense, because that's not how real cities are set up, so I should have changed it. But moving on. Cars swarmed the entrance, blocking any escape he might be able to make. Do these people know that alleyways are formed by buildings sitting next to each other and usually have other ends? What? If it's just a section where the building dips, is it an alleyway? I guess so. I don't know, that's weird. The buildings on either side were long and seemed to reach to the street behind. He was stuck. What? See, that's what I mean. Are there cops back there too? Can you see the cops? Then why can't you see Batman? I have a lot of questions. Everyone jumped out of their cars, guns pulled, aimed down the passageway. Like a rat in a trap, gentlemen, Foley said smugly, grabbing a bullhorn from one of the other cops. John looked uneasily down the alley. In the lowering light of afternoon, it was obscured by the shadows of the buildings that formed it. A strange noise began to build from down there, until it became impossible for them to ignore. John squinted. She could just barely see the shape of something down there in the shadows. She jumped as lights burst from the alleyway. You might have the wrong animal there, sir. The thing rose into the air and roared down the alley towards them. The downdraft caused by it pushed them all to the ground. She watched as the aircraft flew away, a black shadow in the afternoon sky. Are you sure it was him? She asked Foley dryly. He shoved the bullhorn into her hands and stropped off. And that's the end of that chapter. That chapter's not bad. John's chapters sometimes tend to be a little lackluster. I don't think the chapters themselves are really the problem until later, because then they are the problem. But since I don't know much about police stuff, again, you have the same problem where John just kind of stands around while things happen around her. But I think this story tends to make up for it by giving John interesting things to think about, at least in this chapter, when it's not in a situation where she can run around and shoot people or fight people, you know? So yeah, this chapter wasn't bad. I think what's funny about this is that it takes a scene from the movie and renders it in a way where you don't actually see most of the action that happens in that scene anymore, but you can clearly see that the action happened. you know? When they're driving under that overpass and you can see like some of the lights are out and there's glass on the ground, there's a motorcycle. If you've seen the movie, you know what happened there, but John doesn't see it. And I kind of like that. One thing that I do like about this version that I wish I could have made work in the other stories, but couldn't really finagle, or in Batman Begins particularly, is the fact that in this story, and I think I mentioned this like an episode ago or something like that, Batman doesn't have any third person chapters detailing what he does. Instead, all of his actions are seen through the POVs of other characters when Bruce is in costume. So it's usually Selina and John. I don't think there is a chapter of the other POV character seeing Batman until much later, like literally the climax of the story. But yeah, I think that's an interesting choice, and I think I do manage to make it work. But I also like it because it makes Batman come off a lot more mysterious than he does in the other stuff. Despite the fact that the third person chapters, I tried to go out of my way to make sure that Batman's thoughts weren't ever really detailed in the chapters, so it's never like, oh, this was strange to Batman. I always tried to stay neutral with it. Let's move on to the next chapter, which is Selina now. She wasn't surprised at how much silver he had in his office. She had always thought that rich people preferred gold, but apparently the upper class of Gotham had an affinity for silver. Steels, platinums, chromes, they loved the stuff. She could dig a bit of it herself, but usually only if it was attached to a jewel of some kind. A whole house covered in the stuff, however, was just gaudy. She was half listening to the TV in the other room as she worked the lock for the safe, and she didn't particularly care about what they were saying until she heard the word Batman. She paused for a minute. Police aren't saying much. Frankly, they're too busy, but all signs suggest that what we're seeing is, in fact, the return of the Batman. Well, what do you know? She turned back to the safe and slid the goggles from over her eyes. She always liked them. They gave her the silhouette of cat ears when she put them up like that. She listened as the dial clicked home. When she opened it, it was empty. Odd. She got to her feet when she heard Stryver speak. Bane says the Batman interfered, but the task was accomplished. Well, what about the men they arrested? Daggett said back. He says, and I quote, they would die before talking. Where does he find these guys? Open the champagne. She moved on the balls of her feet to the wall beside the door, careful not to let the steel heels of her boots touch the ground. She heard the door open beside her. Hey, can we get some girls in here? Careful what you wish for. She threw him to the floor. When he rose, she kicked him right in the chest, slamming him into a wall. He pulled a gun, but she pinned his arm to the wall with her shoe, trapping his wrist between the platform and the blade of her heel. Her hand went to his neck. What's wrong? She said, knocking the gun from his hand. Cat got your tongue. You dumb bitch, he spat at her, lisping past his constricted throat. She mocked offense. No one's ever called me dumb before. Dumb to come here tonight. She slid her heel up, cutting into his wrist. I want what we agreed on. She heard a click and felt a gun pressed into her head. I want never gets, Daggett said, smirking. She rolled her eyes and lowered her leg from the wall. Nice outfit, she heard Stryver say behind her. Those heels make it tough to walk? I don't know. She dug her heel into his foot, spun, and took his gun. Do they? She spun again and pointed the gun right at Daggett's head. Where is it? Where's what? The clean slate. Oh yeah, the ultimate tool for a master thief with a record. I don't have it. Daggett's bodyguards burst through the doors with their guns drawn. Selina grabbed Daggett and used him as a shield. None of them would shoot. She kicked out one of the windows and the two of them tumbled out, landing on a window cleaning platform 2 floors down. She cut the rope with her heel and the thing plummeted to the roof below. She picked him up and threw him on the asphalt, putting the gun to his chin. Where is it? The clean slate? Typing a name and date of birth. He was cut off by her grabbing his throat. Don't fuck around, idiot. I know what it is. Sounds a little too good to be true, doesn't it? You're lying, she spat. Reich Data took it to prototype stage, and I bought them, but they had nothing, he said with a smirk. It was a gangland myth. Okay, so let me pause real quick, because you'll notice that Daggett's line about the clean slate, type in a name and a place of birth, gets cut off here, and there was a reason for this. For a long time, I thought this line was just a little bit of exposition that Nolan had thrown in so that we knew what the clean slate was exactly. And I was like, well, the clean slate kind of speaks for itself with his name. This is kind of clumsy. So I cut it out. For a while, I was kind of heated about it. Hence why Selina's response is kind of like, I know what the fuck it is. Like, Years later, I would realize that that line is there specifically. Like, he explains it that blatantly because he's trying to make a point to her. And I can't believe it took me that long to realize that, but I did. So now this is in here, and it seems kind of like stupid. She let him go. She had worked. She had put her life on the line to get her hands on that damn program just to find out there was nothing. And even worse, Daggett had just led her on. It takes a special kind of asshole. She grit her teeth. That motherfucker wasn't going to last a goddamn night if she had anything to say about it. This is like the third F-bomb that has been dropped in this story. I don't know if I should comment on this now. I think I might wait till the end of the chapter. But, moving on. She looked up. Men were coming onto the roof with guns. She pulled Daggett by his shirt and held the gun to his head. "Stay back," she said, cocking it. They didn't stop. "I'm not bluffing." "They know," a voice growled behind her. She whipped around. The Batman was crouched on a roof above them. "They just don't care." She flung Daggett on the ground behind her, shot the man nearest her, and disarmed another, shooting him in the head once he was on the ground. The Batman dropped from the roof and was at the men behind her quick as lightning. She took out a few more, then turned the fire at the one he had in a headlock. She dropped him, knocked the gun out of her hand, then kicked the guy in the head. "What the hell was that?" she said. "No guns, no killing. Where's the fun in that?" She turned back to take one more. They just seemed to keep coming when gunshots rang from the other roof. She saw the Batman turn and run for the far edge. She followed him until he jumped. He landed on some kind of vehicle, the plates hissing open to let him in. When she looked back, she saw Daggett strolling in her direction, followed by a man that looked like he was twice his height and 3 times as wide. She wasted no time in following the Batman's path. She landed hard on her feet and scrambled into the back seat as the roof hissed closed behind her. "My mother warned me about getting in the cars with strangers," she said coyly. "This isn't a car." She jumped as the thing thundered to life under them and roared into the air. She watched out the window as the downdraft caused the guys on the roof to duck down, except for the tall one, who didn't seem bothered by it. Then again, it was hard to tell, seeing as a big black mask covered the bottom half of his face. He blinked and he met her gaze. His eyes were deep and dark. Too dark, actually. A deep feeling of dread filled her entire body, and she jumped back and face front. That had to be Bane. This is the reason why the other POV character got cut out of this part, and why I'm not putting him in. Because his chapters ruin that reveal completely, since he is revealed to us, I think, like 4 or 5 chapters before this. But yeah, and I think the thing about it is that the mysterious Bane angle is actually done pretty well. Yeah, it is a little weird that this is basically the same thing as Jonathan Crane's plot, but this is why I advocate for the POV character to have come in the edited chapters later on, because it would have added a twist to that, but we can talk about that later. Once they were well into the air, she was torn between a feeling of awe and wariness. On one hand, the view from up there was absolutely breathtaking, and on the other, she was in a strange aircraft with a man who dressed up like a bat. She might as well have been abducted by aliens. He seemed to have excellent control over the thing, though, and the ride only lasted a few minutes. He landed it on top of a skyscraper in downtown. She jumped out as soon as the top opened. "See you around," she said, sliding down the side. "You're welcome." When she turned back to him, he was already out of the thing. "I had it under control." He just shrugged. "Probably." "I need to know what you did with Bruce Wayne's fingerprints." "He wasn't kidding about his powerful friend," she said. "I sold them to Daggett," she said, shaking her head, "for something that doesn't even exist." How did I miss that repetition? Anyway, I doubt many people get the better of you. She liked him more than Wayne already. Hey, when a girl's desperate. What were they going to do with them? I don't know, but Daggett seemed pretty interested in that mess at the stock market. The sound of a helicopter filled the air. A police chopper flew nearby, searchlights scanning the rooftops. He turned toward the noise, and she took the opportunity to leave, leaping onto the fire escapes below. "Miss Kyle," she heard him say above her. He grunted. So that's what that feels like. And that's the end of that chapter. So that wasn't bad either. The thing that I was commenting on with the curse words, this story has significantly not more curses. Well, it has more curses anyway because there's more words, but also the curses tend to be a little bit more hardcore. And I don't know, like part of it I feel like is that this story is just it's not darker than the other one, but it's dark in a different way. Where this story is more about like actual like real world issues and like things that affect our world, where the last story was about a guy who sprays gas at people and makes them hallucinate scary things. So the tone is a little bit different. But throughout this story, you will notice that the F word gets dropped a lot more. And I don't know, I think the reason why I feel kind of conflicted about it is because part of it comes off as like a childish sort of thing where I was like, ooh, a chance to have some characters who are more edgy. Let's make them say curse words. And there definitely are curse words in here that come off like, okay, you didn't need to say that. But most of the ones that we've seen so far, they come off pretty naturally. I don't know. I do know that I did do it on purpose because I remembered thinking to myself, oh, this story's going to get a ratings jump when I would write like all of the little F words in, which lends credence to my kind of like childish bit, despite the fact that I wrote this when I was 20. So I wasn't like a child, but a lot of my writing from back then has some juvenile aspects. It comes up in Batman Begins too, with the characters who will say things that sound like they come out of the mouths of people their age, but when you read the way that their actions are written, they sound like teenagers or children. I don't know. I think it's just a symptom of me being a lot younger. This was 6 years ago, so. Moving on. I think this will be the last chapter we read this episode. Very inconspicuous, Alfred said as he climbed out from the bat. Shall I tell the neighbors you got yourself a new leaf blower? What neighbors? The bats? The look of distress on Alfred's face was apparent. He always had trouble dropping the voice when he was still wearing the cowl. It was the first thing he handed to him, followed by the cape. From the look of the television coverage, you seem to have your taste for wanton destruction back. He pulled out a USB. I got this. Shouldn't the police be gathering the evidence? They don't have the tools to analyze it, he said, moving to his computer. They would, if you gave them to them. One tool is another man's weapon. In your mind, perhaps, but there aren't many things you couldn't turn into a weapon. Alfred, enough, he said, exasperated. The police weren't getting it done. Perhaps they would have if you hadn't made a sideshow of yourself. You led a bloated police force on a merry chase with some fancy new toys from Fox. What about when you come up against him? What then? Alfred pointed to the screen. Security footage from the stock market played, showing Bane mercilessly killing the building's security. I'll fight harder. I always have. Look at his speed, his ferocity, his training. I've had the same training, Bruce said, sticking the USB into the computer. Bane's just a mercenary, and we have to find out what he's been up to. Text scrolled across the screen. Trades of some kind, coded, he murmured. Then a thumbprint appeared in a separate window. Is that mine? Courtesy of Selena Kyle. He ejected it and handed it to Alfred. Get this to Fox. He can crack the code and tell us what trades they were executing. He got up and headed for the elevator. I find it weird that no one comments on... I know it's because he wears a mask, but no one comments on the fact that Bane is kind of a lot older than Bruce. And people are all like, oh man, you can't be what you were. And he's like going out there and you can't fight him. But him is like 50. And Bruce is literally, I think, in the source material, he's coming up on like 40. Bane is actually old, like even older than 50 then, because he was roughly, it seemed to be like in his 20s or something when Talia was a kid. And Talia's like around the same age as Bruce, if not slightly younger, but probably the same age. So Bane's like 60. And yet no one's like speed and ferocity. And Bruce is never like, I'm younger. But then Alfred's like, well, yeah, but you've also been doing this Batman thing, you've got a lot of injuries. No one ever brings that up. I don't know, it's just a weird little thing. We're gonna have to talk about this chapter quite a bit at the end, because there have been some things coming up, but I don't want to spend a million years talking about it in the middle. But suffice to say, pin Alfred's comments about like him leading the police on a chase and Bruce just being like, they're not getting it done, because we're gonna talk about that. And I will make an effort to remember to actually talk about that. He removed the rest of the suit in the bathroom. He was going to take a shower, but then decided on a bath instead. After he washed, he wanted to soak and let the heat in the water leach the aches from his muscles, but he couldn't get himself to sit still. He kept shifting himself. His arms were practically shaking. He'd been like that the whole day and shrugged it off as the thrill of getting back in the game, but apparently not. He heard Alfred behind him as he walked back to his room. I'll take this to Fox, but no more. Bruce stopped. I've sewn you up and set your bones, but I won't bury you. I've buried enough members of the Wayne family. Bruce turned. You'd leave me? You see only one end to your story. Leaving is all I have to make you understand. You have to find another way. I tried, and I failed. As Bruce Wayne, you can afford to fail. You used to talk about finishing, about life beyond that awful cave. Bruce let out a heavy sigh. What are you trying to prove? Weren't you the one who told me that it was about helping others and not proving anything to anyone, even me? Or you? I did, but this is too far. You aren't Batman anymore. Who am I then? Bruce Wayne, sir. Bruce turned for his room. He's dead, he scoffed. He died with Rachel and Harvey. He could feel Alfred's eyes on him as he walked through the door. All right, so pause right there. Number one, really good conversation. But I do find it weird that after Bruce's comments about, like, how could Alfred possibly think this? He never says, like, I'm not trying to get myself killed. When Alfred's like, you have to find another way, and he's like, I'm not trying to, like, martyr myself, right? Haha. They never, like, talk about that, but I guess that's kind of the sadness of this moment. Though I will say that I do think Bruce saying that wouldn't make Alfred stay around because, like, it's clearly a misunderstanding going on here. But yeah, this is a super important part of Bruce's arc, which the inner monologue, we'll get to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But the idea that, like, Bruce Wayne doesn't exist anymore, like, as a identity, I'm not really sure how to put this, but that's kind of a huge deal. And yeah, I think this is going to expound on that a little bit more when we get deeper into the chapter. So let's keep going. He could not stop twisting and turning when he got in his bed. The covers brought him comfort, but not the luxury of dreams. He did not want to leave himself to his thoughts just yet. Why is that? Okay. But the idea of Alfred leaving him and his inability to decipher the enigma that was his own identity. I guess identity was a good word. But he couldn't stay in bed any longer. He flung off his sheets and went downstairs. He didn't want to bother with the lights, but it was far too dark without them. Again, the lights. Why do they keep commenting on that? That's a weird little detail. He only wanted to switch on a few, but he ended up turning them all on. He had started toward the bridge, but his attention was diverted by the sound of squeaking. A few bats fluttered around the entrance to the largest tunnel. He grimaced. They were the large ones with the massive wings, but his interest had already been piqued, so he turned and made his way around the basin, kicking off his shoes as he went. Why wasn't that 2 sentences? He was surprised at how easily he moved over the rocks barefoot. He didn't know if it was even wise to be in that part of the cave, but he'd done it on impulse. He kept a firm hand on the wall as he moved down the tunnel towards the outside anyway, so that he might not fall into the water at least. Okay. So remember when I talked about in the other story, I kind of, like, back in the day was preoccupied with changing the dialogue so it was quote-unquote less formal. But then there's things like he did not want to leave himself and, like, so he might not fall into the water at least. That definitely sounds like something I would have wrote in, like, the GOT rewrite. It's very back and forth. I don't know what is up with this, but some of these missing contractions are eyebrow-raising. Anyway, as he neared the edge, he noticed several small vines clinging to the cave ceiling, fading and starting to brown. Pin that. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but just every time we talk about the vines in the cave, take note. The chilly air of the outside hit him suddenly when he reached the mouth of the cave. He took a moment to admire the trees in the woods, painted in brilliant shades of orange and yellow and red. The shrubs on the ground were fuller and a bit brighter than they'd been the last time he'd seen this place. He pulled his sleeves down over his hands and wrapped his arms around himself as a breeze blew by. He almost found himself wishing for his cape. Ha 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 ha. I refuse to explain why that's funny. He made his way down the incline into the grass, which was also beginning to fade with the season, and then lowered himself to the ground beside the pond. The place hadn't been half this alive the last time he was there. Then again, that was the dead of winter, and fall had only come about a month ago. He pulled his knees to his chest to stop his legs from shaking. The fuck? It seemed that his thoughts would not leave him for the night, so he tried— See, this is what I'm talking about. So he tried to see to them. The problem, however, is that he couldn't seem to put them— What? The problem, however, is that he couldn't seem to them out at the moment. Sort them out? Is that what that's supposed to say? Maybe. His mind raced back and forth between questions that he couldn't quite answer yet. Why was Alfred so convinced that he was trying to off himself? Was he really leaving him? Had he actually meant it when he told Alfred that Bruce Wayne was dead? If he did, then what did that leave? Batman? Something else entirely? But what then? And had the time of the Batman really come to pass? That last thought didn't sit with him well at all. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he'd only barely noticed that he was crying. He absentmindedly wiped them away with his wrists and rested his head against his knees. His tears were born of pure frustration, he knew, and at the moment he didn't know what to do about it. The whole thing made his jitters worse. He was practically trembling. He only wanted to be calm for a few hours. Was that too much to ask? His eyes darted between the trees and the cliff face and the stream, finally landing on the pond in front of him. The sky was reflected in its surface, the dark blue water rippling with the breeze. He turned his eyes on the real thing and caught sight of a few stars peppering the softly glowing expanse, as well as the moon, hanging bloated and heavy and full up there. The sight of it worked to calm him, and he even felt his muscles loosen. He sighed and rested his head on his knees again. Finally. And that's the end of that chapter. That was good. That last part, like the actual descriptions, though, I don't like the way they were written. The picture they were putting together was really nice. Like this chapter's super important. Like, wow. So anyway, I kind of can't talk about a lot of the stuff in here in depth without hindsight from deeper in the story. So, but suffice to say, there is a lot of symbolism and foreshadowing throughout this chapter that I think is actually pretty well done. One of the things that I am really glad about in this story is that this story has gotten away from Batman Begins' tendency to constantly point out when weird stuff is happening. For example, it's always mentioned, like in the last 2 Bruce chapters, I think, how dark it is in the Batcave. But usually when Bruce mentions it, he just says, God, it's dark in here, and then just kind of moves on and it's like, I turn on the lights, and then that's it. But remember back in Batman Begins when Ra's al Ghul would say something that kind of oddly echoed something in Bruce's head, and Bruce would be like, oh my God, how did he know that? Like, this story has done away with that entirely, and I am so glad. Because I feel like due to that, the foreshadowing in this story is so much more effective. Because it's the kind of thing that you see it, you don't really think anything of it, or you're just kind of like, oh, that's weird. And then later down the line, you read stuff, come back, read the story, and you're like, oh, okay. You know, instead of it being like, look, something weird is happening. You're like, okay, I get it. Leave me alone, you know? And I really like that. I think this chapter is a really good example of that. Though Bruce's last chapter also was kind of full of that stuff too. It's very good. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, was it Bruce's identity? Oh no, Alfred. And to talk about the cops basically. So I feel like this story kind of, I mentioned before that this story wanted to actually confront a lot of social issues that existed in the real world. But I feel like on a lot of fronts, the story kind of falls flat. For example, in this chapter, we had a really good chance to talk about why Bruce doesn't really trust the police to do things when, as far as we know, the police aren't corrupt anymore. And not once does it talk about like state violence or anything like that, which is weird because the fact that the Dent Act is basically like glorified profiling actually is mentioned in a Selena chapter later on, but it's not ever brought up here in the Batman chapter. Like, that seems like a weird thing to just kind of gloss over, like, oh, the police are ineffective, instead of being like, well, the police are out here arresting anybody for looking at the mob, so maybe I'm a little bit wary about them taking this on or something like that. And he never gives a reason for, like, a good reason for why. And I'm like, maybe he doesn't have a good reason. That's fine, too. But his one man's tool is another man's weapon. Of course, light doesn't really get shed on that until I think next chapter. So you don't really understand what he means by that just yet, though he does have a point that's never really expounded upon and why it applies to the police as well as the person that it originally applied to, as we learn next chapter. I just feel like this story kind of like doesn't get into that, which, to be fair, at that time I wasn't as knowledgeable about that kind of stuff, so it kind of makes sense. But I do feel like multiple times this story takes on situations that I didn't fully understand, and then will gloss over a lot of really valid issues, even though it kind of touches on them, but it feels like it was unintentional because it never talks about them, while kind of giving these surface level nods toward other social issues that are a lot more like shallow. Or you get things in the case of like the for his benefit thing, where on one thing it'll work and the commentary works, but in the other thing it kind of doesn't because I didn't adjust for the fact that I changed some things later. This story's kind of all over the place with its commentary, but we'll talk about that as we go through the story and confront it. So, yeah, end of the episode. God, this went on longer than I was expecting. God, that Bruce chapter was a lot longer than I remembered. So, next episode, we are beginning with another Bruce chapter, and I will see you for that. If you like this video, like it on the YouTubes, and then subscribe, watch more videos. You can catch up on this entire Batman series and maybe watch or listen to the podcast about the other of my old fanfics, whatever's posted at the time you're reading this. And I will see you next time, guys. Bye!